Okay, let's move on to the next topic, and this one is a very worrying, concerning report, profound report that was published a couple of days ago, and also I published it yesterday. And it was a poll of 50,000 people across the globe, and it basically asked them a series of questions via a questionnaire about democracy. And I'll just read out the main findings to you, Tom, and to the viewers. The biggest perceived threat to democracy isn't foreign election interference, Russian influence, or the power of big tech. It's economic inequality. Since 2020, more people have become concerned that social media platforms have a negative impact on democracy, particularly in the US and Europe. Since Biden's inauguration, global opinion of the US's impact on democracy worldwide has increased in most parts of the world. However, nearly half of people around the world are still concerned that the US threatens democracy in their country. Fear of China's influence and fear of Russia's influence were lower than the US, who were the overall perceived to be the ultimate threat across all the countries that were questioned, 53 countries. So that is, it's a scary one, isn't it? I mean, is it the Trump effect? I know we're going to talk about Trump later, but is it, the Trump effect, do you think? Is it COVID in terms of our rights being, reduced and withdrawn by governments across the world? Or is it just that people are becoming now much more aware of who and what are to blame, who and what are responsible for undermining and disempowering us? I mean, how do you perceive it, Tom?
Well, I think that's a fascinating study, wasn't it? And a large study, global study, so many countries involved in it. Really fascinating results, and but I would say quite unsurprising, and it shows that people around the world do recognise what some of the obstacles and problems with democracy, obstacles to democracy are, and problems with achieving real democracy in each country, what the threats are. The main thing from the study was it recognised that across the world, people, the electorate in countries all across the world, recognise that the biggest two threats were economic inequality and the influence of the USA. Really fascinating. And we should perhaps just explore each of those individually. I mean, economic inequality is both within each country and I think sort of global inter-country, if you like. So obviously there are whole countries suffering massive poverty, and it's very difficult to achieve democracy in countries that are really suffering poverty, and it's perhaps easier for vested interests, talking of corporations and as well as other nations' governments, to influence democracies in poorer countries, and for the people of their own countries to achieve true democracy is much harder when there's widespread poverty. So yeah, economic inequality is huge, and also what we're seeing here is that there's perhaps democracy or access to power and influence over democracy held by a smaller and smaller number of incredibly wealthy people. So if you're rich, you have access to the politicians, the decision makers, you influence them via think tanks, via donations, via having a word, via text, having a swanky dinner party where people are invited, politicians are invited, all those ways in which lobbying and corruption happens. And the prevalence of particularly right-wing think tanks. I don't often hear about left-wing think tanks, but right-wing think tanks are in abundance, mostly funded by very wealthy Americans, and have a huge influence on politics across the globe, including here in the UK. So there's a big issue here that if you have money, you have access. and you can influence power, and you can influence democracy and government's decision making. If you're poor, you're lucky if you can vote.
And I think the most astounding, I've hard to put it into words really, but the most important and astounding feature of the report for me and my wider research is, in the past, people have really slammed those people who don't vote. When in actual fact, what we're seeing more and more now, and understanding more and more now, actually, is for a lot of people who simply choose not to vote, they seem now to be the wise ones, because they've realized that it doesn't matter who you vote for, primarily you're getting the same parcel. It might have different packaging, it might be wrapped up in a different way, but effectively the contents, the substance are pretty much the same.
Yeah.
So the idea that people, when they turn out to vote and they're told to vote, go and change things, I think for a lot of people now, they're realizing that there simply is no point. It's just, it's this hot air. We're not going to be able to change things. If you look statistics across decades in individual countries, very little changes. And we're coming on to homelessness later, but you look at the number of people who are homeless, number of people unemployed. You look at the number of hate crimes. I know we talked about this last week across the world. When a government comes in, you expect, okay, let's give them some time. You give them time, and nothing really changes.
No.
It's just a different figurehead at the top of major political parties that effectively run, as you said earlier, by corporations.
Yeah. Well, my dad always used to say, don't vote, it'll only encourage them. Of course, he always voted, but it was just something he said as a funny.
Yeah.
But, there's obviously some truth to it. I mean, arguably, in so many countries around the world, including the UK, you can't gain power, you can't come to power, you can't be a party that forms a government without looking after the interests of the big corporations and the wealthy, including the owners of most of our media. Without their support, you've got no chance of coming to power and having any influence at all. So, of course, that's been an issue for the Labour Party for some time. Is do they renounce what they originally and have generally always stood for, the interests of working people over capital, and suck up to the Murdochs of this world, as Tony Blair did. Bearing in mind, no party has won an election in the UK without the support of the Sun newspaper since 1974. Wow, what's that, 56 years? 46 years. 46 years, that's staggering. Do they not suck up to corporate interests and be true to themselves as a party that stands for the interests of working people, families, communities, and be perpetually a party of opposition and never gain power and never have a chance to influence anything? Very, very difficult. The other thing, obviously, that was huge in the survey was this in the study was the revelation that across the world people view America as the biggest threat to their own democracy, and it's interesting. I mean, they've got good reason. I think history shows people have very good reason to come to that conclusion. And America have in the name of democracy, in the name of spreading democracy around the world, peace and democracy. Of course, America have been almost perpetually at war, and have been involved in undermining and overthrowing governments, including lots of democratically elected governments all across the world, particularly in South America. That's gone from deposing a democratically elected government in Iran and putting the Shah in all those years ago to more modern times where they're undermining a democratically elected Maduro's democratically elected government in Venezuela. So they're always at it, and they always want to get rid of democratically elected governments where they're not essentially aligned with capitalist America's thinking and desires.
But I think key to that, Tom, as
Yeah.
well, is that it's not just the way in which that they interfere with countries and often devastate any opposition or any group that is going against their interests, going against their ideology, but it's then the lies and propaganda that they then put out later to make out that what they're doing is the Good Samaritan.
Always, yeah.
And what everybody else was trying to do, even within their own country, which the US didn't have any right to be there. But even these people, it's like they're saving us from the devil, when in actual fact it's the other way round. But we do need to move on. So if we make this one the last point.
Yeah, just before we do, I mean, obviously, America needs to look at itself in terms of its own democracy, which American people that took part in the survey recognised is a massive problem. You know, people are concerned in America that their democracy is now failing, far from being the shining beacon on a hill. You know, that they have in many ways, a failing democracy, a failing society. And it's worth noting that since the election at the end of 2019, the Republican Party have been taking a pickaxe to democracy in states. Obviously, individual states in America are responsible for the running of the election in each state. They have voted through since the last election. Republican legislatures have voted through 81 anti-protest bills in 34 states. And we must consider protest a democratic right to protest as an essential element of democracy, including a law in Oklahoma that protects drivers who have run over protesters with their cars. And also, since the election, state legislatures have proposed over 250 new voter suppression laws in 43 different states, including getting rid of mail ballots, the imposition of photographic voter ID, which a lot of poor people don't possess, the scrapping of Sunday voting, which is particularly popular within the Black community, changing the opening times of polling stations, instead of being from 7 till 7, making them 9 to 5, which makes it very difficult for a lot of working people to vote. Even to pass a law to say that it's going to be illegal to give water to someone stood in line waiting to vote. Bear in mind, of course, that that in the poorer communities, and particularly Black and ethnic minority communities in America, lines of people waiting to vote, 6, 8, 10 hours people were waiting to vote at the last election. It's now going to be illegal to give those people water. It's potentially tens of millions of people will be disenfranchised and unable to vote as a result of this. And it's a really shocking attack on democracy.
But to finish off, as depressing as all that is, to finish off, at least his poll shows that people around the world are perceptive.
Yeah,
that they see it.
People see the corruption, the damage to their democracy. People care about democracy. I think they care about democracy. They care about justice. And when they see things that are unjust, they see a society that's increasingly unfair, that operates in the interests of a small number of very rich people, and where even their voice is cancelled, disenfranchised, etc. People care about that, and hopefully, as well as seeing the ravaging effects of climate change, within a few years, I think in a lot of countries we'll see people rise up and say no more.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thanks.